Thank you, Dr. Andres. Really appreciate having the opportunity to come here. It's always it's a real privilege and honor to speak here in Arnold Auditorium in Roosevelt Hall. And I'd like to just get right to it. Here's where we are, and Rich talked about this a little bit, where we are in terms of strategic logic. You heard about this first from Adam Oler and Steve Heffington. We've talked about analyzing the strategic situation, defining the desired ends. Now we're getting into means and ways. So that's where we are kind of on the spectrum. And I'm going to talk to you today about one particular means and ways, and that is the diplomatic instrument. What it is, how to use it, how to blend it with other instruments. My plan for today, I'm going to take a quick look at definitions to begin. Then I'm going to give you 3 real-world examples of diplomacy being used in practice. Not necessarily great diplomatic moments in world history, but 3 cases that I think illustrate how to blend the instrument and how to use it. And then, as I said, how to blend it and how to use it with other instruments. We'll talk a little bit about diplomacy and the development of strategy, which is important, especially because we work in the building where George Kennan worked. We'll give you one incident of the usefulness of diplomats as senior advisors, and I'm going to conclude with some tips on how you can use the diplomatic instrument as strategists, both here at the War College and in your assignments afterwards. Okay, first let's start with some definitions. You're probably wondering, what is it? All right, what is diplomacy? I know that's on a lot of people's minds, and it's a bit of a fuzzy concept for people who haven't worked in it. I think there are good definitions and bad definitions. Let's start with the bad. Let's go through some bad ones. This one I don't really like. I'm not going to tell you where the bad ones come from because I'm going to try to be diplomatic, but you may come across the source. But the outward expression of foreign policy, this kind of brings to mind kind of emoji diplomacy, right? Emoticon diplomacy. I guess like if we don't like your démarche, we'll send you something like this, right? I mean, I'm kind of old school. It doesn't really do it for me. I guess if we're really annoyed, we'd send something like this. Again, it doesn't really do it for me. Give you another definition, official engagement. Don't you love that word? That can mean just about anything you want it to mean. It could mean shifting from second into third. It could mean a lot of things. It could mean this. I mean, the Deputy Assistant Secretary has taken an important step there. So we're not going to use that word. Here's one. This is actually from a noted diplomat, a very prestigious diplomat who will remain anonymous. The adjustment of relations between states by mutual agreement. Clear as mud, right? Kind of reminds me of this. Reminds me of orthodonture. Listen, we're just going to make some minor adjustments. This is not going to hurt a bit. You'll be fine. I don't like this definition. Yuck. Here's some better ones that I kind of like a little bit better. I like this one. The conduct of international relations typically by a country's representatives abroad. I particularly like that phrase about a country's representatives abroad because this is an activity carried out by officials with foreign governments. I like this one. The practice of fostering relationships with foreigners in order to resolve issues and advance interests. I like the fostering relationships part because that's about contacts, and we're going to talk about establishing and using contacts overseas. Here's one I like, the established method of influencing the decisions and behavior of foreign governments through dialogue, negotiation, and other measures short of war or violence. What I like about this one is the part about influencing the decisions and behaviors of foreign governments. And that gets close to the definition that I think is most useful for you as 6,000 level strategists at the National War College. That's this one. I like this definition, persuading foreign governments to do things we want them to do. I mean, you can come up with a lot more complicated definitions. You could say, wait a second, what about multilateral diplomacy? What about trade negotiations, negotiating tactics? At this point, when you're looking at diplomacy, I think this is a useful way to think about this instrument as strategists at the National War College. So we're going to use that quite a bit. Now, this raises a question. How do you persuade these foreign governments to do the things you want to do? How do you do this? This gets us to a very important issue. How is this done? Because we're talking about means and ways. And I know a lot of you are thinking, okay, persuade them, but how? To answer this question, I think what you should do, I would ask you to do this, is to look around you. Look at the State Department officers who are here with you in the class, the State Department faculty members who are here, because that's where the answer is. When you do this, I think the answer is blindingly obvious. This is how we do it. I mean, am I right? Look. No, but seriously, here's how we do it. Look, I mean, charm and charisma is a part of it, but there's much more to it than that. And I think this is important. This is going to be a kind of a central theme that runs all through today's lecture, and that is diplomacy involves the use of a set of skills and abilities that are developed in a profession over time. These skills and abilities include language skills, cultural expertise, country expertise, cultural knowledge, having trusted contacts and knowing how to use them, having negotiating skills, and I think very important, experience. People who have these things, who are in a profession that develops these abilities, are better able to carry out the persuasive effort on behalf of their government. I think you're going to see that. You know, this came up in Seminar C. Is Aziz, are you here from Niger? Yeah. We got to this point in the discussion in seminar, and we were talking about how to approach a government. And Aziz said something very astute. He said, the person who's doing this has to know about the culture. He or she has to know the language and how best to approach the people in the culture and society that they're hoping to influence. And there was a lot of wisdom in that statement, and I think that's what I'm getting to here. We're going to talk about that in more detail, but remember this, because this will be a recurring theme as I go through 3 cases of diplomacy in use, as I talk about the diplomat as a strategist, and as I talk also about the diplomat as an advisor in time of crisis. All right, contacts. I think it's important to think about this as diplomacy as a contact sport. What does that mean? It means that it's all about personal contacts that we as diplomats establish when we're overseas or working in Washington. When your government is trying to get something done overseas, we should not have to cold call people and ask them to do something for us. It's far better if we're working with people who we've established a professional relationship with, who know us, who trust us, and who we can work with effectively. Now, who are these contacts? Those of you who haven't worked in embassies might not be aware of the fact that day to day in U.S. embassies and in the embassies of other countries around the world, diplomats are out there making and maintaining contacts with people in that society. I mean everybody. If you go to a 4th of July party at a U.S. embassy anywhere in the world, you're going to get a view of who we're in contact with. It's pretty impressive. If the embassy is doing its job, and they're almost always doing it, they're trying to reach out and establish contact with just about everybody. Politicians from the opposition party, business leaders, journalists, academics, military officers, bankers, economists, religious leaders, educators, everybody. Our job is to learn about that society and to develop contacts that will help us understand it. Also to develop contacts that will allow us, when necessary, to reach out and persuade that government or that society to carry out a change that we think is in our interest. So it's important to keep in mind the contact aspect of it. A lot of times people disparage the contact work and say, oh, the diplomats, they're just drawing up cables to send back to Washington that nobody reads. Well, sometimes they don't read them. But I think it's important to remember, from the point of view of the strategist, that the reporting and the contact work is important not just for the cables that we send back, but because it provides the basis upon which we can develop strategies to persuade, to get them to adopt policies and positions that are in our national interest. I think it's important to keep that in mind. It's not just for the cables. This gets us to the concept of statecraft. Deibel talks about this phase in strategic logic as statecraft. And this word, I think, is really important for strategists because it evokes the idea of craft, of skill, of wisdom, of creativity, the blending of instruments and the figuring out of how are we going to get this job done for our home government. I'm going to talk about some cases. And again, some of these cases, you might ask, why is he talking about this? I've selected them because I think they're useful in illustrating the use of the instrument and its blending. Yesterday you heard about gray zone operations. I guess that's the current buzzword, but I guess we were involved in gray zone operations in El Salvador during the 1980s. I chose this one because it's a good example of a whole of government approach and a blending of instruments. go through it in terms of strategic logic, let me start with what I think was our interest statement. So we're in El Salvador. It's the mid-'80s. Cold War is still on. The wall is still up. The Soviet Union is still a thing. And the United States, I would say, has an important security interest in preventing a hostile power, in this case the Soviet Union, from establishing client states in the Western Hemisphere. I think you could defend that as a good interest statement because it's consistent with longstanding U.S. policy, it goes back to the Monroe Doctrine, and certainly consistent with the containment strategy that George Kennan cooked up for us right here in Roosevelt Hall. So I would say that was the interest. I don't ever remember actually seeing this on a piece of paper during the time, but I think that's what everybody had in mind during this period. Okay, what's the threat? U.S. interest is threatened by the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front. The FMLN is allied with the Soviets. There was no doubt about that. And here's the story and the problem. A weak Salvadoran military is alienating its population by routinely violating human rights and ignoring democratic norms. There was no doubt about this either. And we were clear-eyed about it. Here's another complicating factor. We're just a few years out of Vietnam at this point, and people are paranoid in the United States about another Vietnam. I can't tell you how many books were out there, El Salvador, America's Next Vietnam. People didn't want to do that again, so this put a real constraint on our activities. Here's how I think the political aim came out. Prevent the FMLN from taking power by force of arms in El Salvador. I think that's what we were tasked with doing. That's what we were working on. This creates a big dilemma. Uncle Sam is faced with a military challenge. The FMLN was not an agrarian reform group. They were an armed force, and they were close to taking power in El Salvador in the early '80s. We are usually good at dealing with military challenges because we have a big military instrument, but we can't use that big military instrument here because of the concerns about Vietnam. So we're constrained. Uncle Sam is in a real problem. What are we going to do? I think this is the classic case that calls out for a blending of instruments. I'm going to talk now about objectives. The objectives we selected, I'm not going to put M first, right? Because I think there's a tendency for us to think that M is always sort of the centerpiece and that D is kind of a sidecar, maybe with a little E somewhere there. And I don't think that was the case here, and I'll try to make that argument as we go through. We had to persuade the Salvadorans to do something if we were to obtain our political aim. One of the things we had to persuade them to do was to stop the massacres, to stop the human rights violations. We knew, everybody who worked on El Salvador knew that this was a massive problem, and it was definitely a recruiting tool, probably the major recruiting tool that enemy forces were using to fill their ranks with desperate Salvadorans who were willing to fight against a government that was routinely massacring them. So you didn't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that if the Salvadorans were going to have any chance of winning the war and preventing the FMLN from taking power through force of arms, they had to stop the massacres. And that really called for a major diplomatic effort. Second, support for a civilian government. You know, at this point, El Salvador had been ruled for generations by military regimes, colonels and generals. This contributed to the human rights problem that we just discussed. And we realized that if we were going to convince young Salvadorans that there was no need for them to take up arms, it would be much easier if the person who was running the country was actually elected democratically and was a civilian. The person in the center there is Jose Napoleon Duarte, who was the president of El Salvador, elected in 1984. And that election took place in no small measure because of pressure from the United States. I'm not saying that we forced this down anybody's throats. There were millions of Salvadorans who also wanted to live under a democratic government. But we used our influence to make sure that he was the president and the people that you see kind of hovering around him were kept in their place. Because once you become president in a country like El Salvador in a crisis, there's no guarantee that you're going to stay president. And it helps if you have Uncle Sam standing behind you, supporting you. We did support him. We supported him in a big way. This is where the E instrument comes in. USAID ramped up their support for this government in a very substantial way once Duarte became president. And so that is an important element of E support. Okay, I am going to mention the M instrument. Don't worry about it. Here we go. we were also facing a military challenge. The Salvadoran military was weak. We needed to strengthen it. So we launched a limited, I'd say very limited, assistance effort with the Salvadorans. It was about $100 million a year. The gentleman on the left there is Colonel John Wagelstein, Commander, 7th Special Forces Group at the time, the U.S. Mill Group Commander in El Salvador. He's currently at the War College, at the Naval War College up in Newport. I guess he couldn't get a job here, so he had to go up to Newport. But anyway, we did launch an important military assistance program. The number of advisors was extremely limited. Again, wariness about Vietnam, people had seen this movie before. Advisors lead to ground troops, lead to 500,000 troops in Vietnam. They didn't want that. The number of advisors that we were limited to in El Salvador was 55. 55, not 5,500, not 55,000, 55. So this required a real careful focusing of advisory expertise. By the way, Jamie and I were talking about where that number comes from. I think it was a negotiation with Capitol Hill, and I'm told that it was based on the speed limit. All right, now here's one thing about diplomacy in a situation like this. This is a heavy lift. We're pushing for big changes. And whenever you do this in a foreign country, the locals who don't want the change, in this case the military, are going to hope like crazy that this is just some scheme cooked up by the embassy and that it doesn't really have the backing of Washington. They love to do that. They're trying to find daylight between the embassy people who are pushing this stuff and the real folks who are in charge back in Washington, and they're really hoping that there is that daylight. So it's important, if you're doing something like this, to make clear to them that there is no daylight, that the embassy is pushing loyally the policy of the United States government in Washington. We got a big assist in this area, and we often do get this kind of assist with a big high-level official visit. The case of El Salvador, in December 1983, Vice President George H.W. Bush flew down for a visit at a critical moment. This was the kind of picture that appeared in the paper. Looks like standard diplomatic stuff, right? He's making nice with the locals. He's, sipping champagne at a reception. But there was much more to the visit than that. During the visit, Vice President Bush and a small security team were secretly flown out of San Salvador on a U.S. helicopter for a meeting with the Salvadoran Military High Command. This is at the time we were trying to push for improvement in human rights performance. One officer, one U.S. Marine Corps officer who was present for the meeting, quotes the key line that Vice President Bush delivered to the Salvadoran commanders. He told them, quote, "If the human rights violations and killings don't stop, and if you don't hold elections, we are going to cut off your aid and it will stop you dead in your tracks." Pretty clear. It's a pretty pointed message. I think he had to do it that way because we were in such an emergency. Not only that, he knew how to do this. Realize this wasn't the first time he was exercising diplomatic skill. This is a former U.S. ambassador to China, former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, former director of the CIA. He knew how to do this, and he did it with skill. The report from the Marine Corps officer says, Bush didn't wait around for a response. He abruptly left, leaving the officer behind with a handwritten list of military officers implicated in death squads that the United States wanted removed from command. I think this clearly established that there was no daylight between what the embassy was pushing and what the U.S. government in Washington wanted. Now, I want to, all of us at the embassy, all of us in the mission, were involved in pushing for this change. It was not just that he would come down and deliver this message. It required a consistent push. I was there as probably the lowest ranking member on this whole team. I'm the second gringo from the left here. And even in the little course that we were teaching, and I was involved in teaching a course on counterinsurgency and psychological operations, even in that course, we placed a heavy emphasis on these changes that we wanted carried out in El Salvador, on the need for the Salvadoran military to respect human rights, and on the need for them to support civilian government in their country. To give you an example of how much of a combined effort this was, when we got to that point in the syllabus where they were getting the class on human rights and civilian democratic rule, we had a guest speaker come in. We did several iterations of the course. each time the person who came in and delivered that lecture was the U.S. ambassador to El Salvador. And Ed Corr would come in and he would very clearly tell them pretty much what George H.W. Bush has said to their senior commanders earlier on. I think we were very effective in this. I think that this push, we didn't completely change Salvadoran behavior overnight, but a steady push from the United States did lead to an improvement in human rights practices by the Salvadoran military. I think this whole thing was a win for the United States. Did we achieve the political aim? We did. Did we prevent the FMLN from gaining power by force of arms in El Salvador? We did. Now, this whole thing wrapped up, of course, after the wall fell and after the Soviets went out of business. But this was a long period of time. Bush went there in '83, and we had to hold the line until '89 at least, perhaps to '92. So I score this as a win for the United States, and I think it was a win because we carefully, skillfully combined and blended the resources. I would submit that this was mostly a diplomatic effort with support from M and support from E. People, you could take a different view. Some people will see it as primarily a military effort. But I think that unless we had pushed for those changes, we would never have been able to win or allow the Salvadorans to prevent the FMLN. If we had just pumped in military assistance, that would not have been enough, in my view. So I see this primarily as a diplomatic effort. A couple other examples. Move on now, real quick. Dominican Republic. Now we're in the mid-90s. You say, well, what do we care about this place? Why? Who cares? Where's the U.S. interest here? You say, well, proximity to the United States, but Miami's a long way off. Well, yeah, but over here, U.S. territory is actually quite close. And this is one of the driving factors that made us think about U.S. interest in that country. Proximity is an important, I think, determinant of how interested you are in a country. And the DR is quite close to the U.S. 1994, we faced a problem, electoral fraud. I'll introduce the folks. This is Joaquin Balaguer. He was the president of the Dominican Republic, pretty much president for life. He'd been president on and off since about 1962. The person in the center, Donna Reinach, U.S. ambassador to the Dominican Republic, career Foreign Service officer with a lot of experience in Latin America. The man on the end there, Jose Francisco Peña Gomez, the opposition political leader. Polls indicated in 1994 that Peña Gomez was going to win it. He had enormous popular support, especially among poor Dominicans. What happened, however, was that President Balaguer had gotten used to being president, and he didn't want to stop. So to make a long story short, he stole the election. We know how they did it. They got the party list for Peña Gomez. They got access to the electoral board computers, and they ran a delete program. It's really hard to win an election if most of the people in your party have been deleted from the voting list. We found out about it from our contacts. Well, the confirmation came from our contacts. Kelly Keiderling was there at the time. She probably got the same kind of phone calls that I did. But on that Sunday morning early, almost all the embassy officers started getting calls from their contacts saying, I tried to vote. I had my voter registration card in my hand, and they told me I wasn't registered. And I also noticed that this only happened to people who were going to vote for Peña Gomez. So it was pretty clear what had happened. This was a major challenge to U.S. interest. Let me put it this way. Look at it this way. Here's how I would do it. The interest. The U.S. has an interest in the democratic development of neighboring countries. It's in our interest that these countries become more stable, more peaceful, more democratic, more prosperous. The threat to this was the electoral fraud that took place in '94. This threatened to derail all of the things that we've been trying to achieve in that country. I would say that our political aim was a Dominican Republic back on the path of democratic development. And our objective was to persuade the Dominicans to take corrective action to address the fraud. All right, I'm going to just tell you about one incident in which we moved to try to get them to take the action that we wanted. There were many démarches, there were many meetings, many conferences, many messages delivered, but I'm just going to describe one. And it was devised, it was designed, it was crafted by Ambassador Donna Reinach. She decided that we needed to speak to them clearly about what was at stake for them. She decided to use the E instrument. She decided to do it using her official residence, the residence of the U.S. ambassador in the country like the Dominican Republic is a very important, very powerful place. She told us on the embassy staff to organize a breakfast, and the guest list would be carefully selected. The Dominicans who would be invited would have to meet two characteristics. First, they would have to be business owners operating using preferential market access to the U.S. market. There were a lot of businesses established in the Dominican Republic in free trade zones. You could assemble your clothing, some of you might be wearing some of it right now, and then once it was assembled in the Dominican Republic, import it to the United States duty-free, preferential access. They were making a lot of money on this program, and there was a lot of rich Dominicans who had an interest in seeing that program continued. You see where I'm going with this, right? Okay. The second characteristic in order to be invited, you had to be politically close to President Joaquin Balaguer, AKA the fraudster, because we were going to try to persuade them to carry a message for us to Balaguer. It wasn't a matter of just walking into the presidential palace and saying, gee, Mr. President, we really don't like your electoral fraud, frowny face. No, that wouldn't work. So this was a more effective way to do it. This is where we talk about statecraft, skill, craft, wisdom. How do you do it? Breakfast started. I'll go through it real quick. I was the econ officer, the economic officer, so we had determined beforehand that I would be the one to deliver the key message. So they're all eating their scrambled eggs and drinking coffee. All of a sudden, ting, 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 the ambassador says, we have a few words with you we want to share with you. We want to make sure you have a clear understanding of how we view the situation. And I'm going to ask Bill Meara, our economic officer, to talk to you about the possible consequences of your current electoral problem. Over to you, Bill. So I started out, I said, it was wonderful, I loved it. I said, look, we understand this is a Dominican problem. This is for you to resolve. It's not for us to come in here and tell you how to run your country. They love that part. They kept drinking the coffee, they're drinking orange juice, everything's great, happy breakfast. But then I said, but there's something you need to consider. The United States of America is under no obligation to continue to provide the Dominican Republic with preferential access to our market if we determine that your country no longer respects or no longer has democratic legitimacy. Okay? Wow. They stopped eating at that point. All the forks dropped. They started looking at me. They looked at the ambassador. There was actually some yelling and screaming at this point because they understood our message. Our message was, yeah, sure, this is a problem for you to resolve, but we're under no obligation to continue to provide you with beneficial trade access to our market if you don't correct the injustice that took place on election day. We want you to correct it. This is an effort to persuade. This is diplomacy in action. This is D backed up by the E instrument. You know, when you do something like this, ideally, later in the afternoon, President Balaguer would appear on TV and say, I've seen the light. Yes, we must correct it. It really doesn't work that way. There's usually a delay. There's usually some other moves, some other things happen. But as I recall, about 2 or 3 weeks after this breakfast, President Balaguer did go on TV. And he said that he had looked into the matter. And believe it or not, there were some irregularities on Election Day. Indeed there were. And that he had, in close consultation with Jose Francisco Peña Gomez, determined that do-over elections should be held. In about 18 months, they would be internationally supervised. They would be carried out without irregularities. Mission accomplished. Actually, they did hold the elections. Balaguer did lose, and an opposition party candidate, not Peña Gomez, but another party candidate won, and that election was certified as really beyond reproach. And Jimmy Carter came down and certified it. So it was a win for the United States. I think this is another example of us achieving our aim through a skillful use and a skillful blending of the diplomatic instruments. Look, sometimes we don't blend them. Sometimes it's just straight D. And I'm going to give you an example of that. All right, one thing about diplomacy, I want to throw up a couple quotes here. It's relevant to my conversations with Carlos Cesar. You're chuckling. I know these are popular. These are often repeated. You know, Wooten back in 1604, an honest gentleman sent abroad to lie for the good of his country. Diplomacy, a patriotic art of lying for one's country. I mean, a lot of people believe this. I think those of us who are actually in the diplomatic profession know that it's completely the opposite. I think having a reputation for integrity and having honesty in your interaction with the foreigners is extremely important. Now, you can't be candid. All governments have secrets, and there are things you can't talk about, but you certainly shouldn't lie to them. So I would disagree with Mr. Wooten and Mr. Bierce here from the Devil's Dictionary. Here's kind of a clever way of putting it. Very Italian. I liked it. Here's Churchill. Again, clever, skill. A lot of people said this. Churchill, I'm sure, at some point said it, but it's attributed to him, and it sort of matches with him, doesn't it? There's another version that says that you tell them to go to hell, but you do it in such a way that they actually turn to you and ask for directions. But I'm strongly in disagreement with the idea about lying to the foreigners. I don't think you should ever do it. Hey, few quick words about strategy development. We work here in the school that, in a certain sense, George Kennan built after the Second World War. And it was here, right in this building, right in the office of the Deputy Commandant, that he really developed the containment strategy that got us through the war, that got us through the Cold War. I think a marvelous, a really amazing and important diplomatic development. But, ask yourself, how did Kennan do that? Kennan was a Foreign Service officer. He was a Russia hand. He was an expert on Russia. He was deeply immersed in Russian culture. He spoke Russian. He had become expert at the use of their musical instrument, the balalaika. He was writing a biography of Chekhov. His uncle, the first George Kennan, had also been a Russia hand, had been an advisor on Russia to Theodore Roosevelt, who built this building. He was deeply immersed in the culture. He knew it. He served there many times. He was the DCM in Moscow. And he came back here right at the moment where we were trying to figure out what to do about this new and very unwelcome threat. We had just gotten through World War II, and suddenly we have this new ominous force in the world, the Soviet Union, with a very large combat experienced army and apparently really an aggressive ideology behind them. Kennan was able to figure out what we should do. While he was here, he wrote an article for Foreign Affairs magazine under the pseudonym Mr. X. SecDef Forrestal authorized him to do this. But look at the title of that, The Sources of Soviet Conduct. He understood the Russians. He had lived with them. He had the cultural knowledge, the language skills, all those things that I mentioned after charm and good looks and all that stuff. He knew this place. It was that knowledge that enabled him to become the strategist whose strategy got us through the Cold War. I think it's important to remember that skill set that he had. I'm going to mention one other Foreign Service officer. Oh, one other thing about Kennan. It's interesting. One of the reasons that Kennan was so successful was because he was an unusually strong writer. He had contemporaries who were similarly proficient at Russian and as knowledgeable about Russia. Chip Bolin, for example, was in the same league. But Kennan was a stronger writer. And when it came time to write that article and to write the containment strategy, those writing skills really put him in a position to do it. Let me talk to you about another Foreign Service officer. Of the same generation, somebody who doesn't get anywhere near the attention that Kennan gets, but as I think you'll see, he probably deserves it. Foreign Service officer Llewellyn Tommy Thompson, a Russia hand, like Kennan, fluent in Russia, was ambassador in Moscow, late 50s, early 60s, and really pulled off, I think, an amazing achievement in terms of contact work. In the height of the Cold War, he and his wife were able to develop good personal and professional relationships with Nikita Khrushchev and his wife, to the point that Khrushchev invited Thompson and his wife to spend part of the summer vacation with them in their family summer home outside Moscow. That's pretty good. I'm going to play you a clip from a video. We're now in October 1962. We are on the edge of nuclear war. McNair says we came this close. And Kennedy is struggling with what to do, how to respond to the situation that has grown up around the missiles in Cuba. We're close to nuclear war with the Soviet Union. I'm going to play you a clip. It goes about 4 minutes. It begins with Kennedy talking to McNamara, who is the Secretary of Defense. Kennedy ran a tape system in his office, so we have the opportunity to listen in on their conversations. And then later you'll hear McNair, you'll see him, he's the narrator. But go ahead and roll the clip.
Kennedy was trying to keep us out of war. I was trying to help him keep us out of war. And General Curtis May, whom I served under, as a matter of fact, in World War II, was saying, let's go in, let's totally destroy Cuba. On that critical Saturday, October 27th, we had two Khrushchev messages in front of us. One had come in Friday night, and it had been dictated by a man who was either drunk or under tremendous stress. Basically, he said, if you'll guarantee you won't invade Cuba, we'll take the missiles out. Then, before we could respond, we had a second message that had been dictated by a bunch of hardliners. And it said, in effect, if you attack, we're prepared to confront you with massive military power. So what to do? We had this, I'll call it the soft message and the hard message. At the elbow of President Kennedy was Thompson, former U.S. ambassador to Moscow. He and Jane, his wife, had literally lived with Khrushchev and his wife upon occasion. Tommy Thompson said, Mr. President, I urge you to respond to the soft message. The President said to Tommy, we can't do that. It'll get us nowhere. Tommy said, Mr. President, you're wrong. And that takes a lot of guts. Thompson's mind was this thought: Khrushchev's got himself in a hell of a fix. He would then think to himself, my God, if I can get out of this with a deal that I can say to the Russian people, Kennedy was going to destroy Castro, and I prevented it. Thompson, knowing Khrushchev as he did, thought Khrushchev will accept that. And Thompson was right. That's what I call empathy. We must try to put ourselves inside their skin and look at us through their eyes, just to understand the thoughts that lie behind their decisions and their actions.
Yeah, I think I think this is a good example of how those diplomatic skills, how that contact work can really prove very valuable to senior leaders in times of crisis. I think what Thompson was doing there, he was making use of that contact work, making use of his skill, his knowledge of Russia, of the Soviet Union, of Nikita Khrushchev himself. Look, I think that was a really important moment. I mean, I was 4 years old, living on Manhattan Island in New York City at the time. Maybe if Thompson hadn't been there, I wouldn't be here, neither would any of you. There could have been a big smoking hole here where Fort McNair is right now. But this was a really critical moment. And I think that's why I think Tommy Thompson probably deserves a lot more attention than he gets. Hey, look, Kennedy got really good advice from him, but I want to point out something to you here. That kind of advice is not just available to the President of the United States in time of crisis. It's also available to all of you. In the spring, you're going to travel out to U.S. embassies and you're going to interact with the country team. I have here pictures. This is two embassies we visited. That's Guatemala, our embassy in Guatemala on the left, and our embassy in Costa Rica and San Jose on the right. In each of these embassies, there's a country team. We say that diplomacy is a contact sport. I think it's also a team sport. This is a kind of a typical country team. And when we talk about the country team concept, what it means is that all representatives of executive branch agencies, with the exception of troops deployed under the authority of a COCOM, are under the supervision of the U.S. ambassador in this country. You know, you've all heard about how dysfunctional the interagency system here is in Washington. It is dysfunctional. It's really ugly. It's not pleasant, believe me. One place that it really works well is in U.S. embassies around the world. And you're going to find out about that when you go out there. When we went to Central America at one point, after an afternoon of meetings with the country team, of speaking candidly with our colleagues who lived there, who spoke the language, who knew people, who knew in detail about what was going on there. We got out into the van, and a Marine Corps officer in our team jumped in. He just spontaneously looked at me and he said, "Wow, a lot of smart people in that building." And I said to him, "That's right, that's an important lesson. Make sure that you tap into that expertise. Make sure that the 4-star that you're working for knows how to use that expertise, because it could be as effective for him or for her as it was with Kennedy and Tommy Thompson." I urge you to kind of keep that in mind as you go through your work. All right, I'm going to wrap it up here and just talk a little bit about how you can use the diplomatic instrument in your strategy. One thing we notice with students here, there's a tendency when they're faced with a problem, especially if it's a bad problem, to sort of get to the end and realize that they haven't solved it, and then they pull out the diplomatic sauce. They pour a whole lot of diplomatic sauce on it and say, "There, we'll have the diplomats do some diplomat stuff, and that'll fix it." Don't do that. Listen, Bismarck, I mean, notice the nice colorized picture of Bismarck. His quote, "Politics is the art of the possible, the attainable." I think you have to keep that in mind because I think it applies to diplomacy as well. There are things that we can help with, things that the instrument can be used to fix. There's other stuff where probably not. You have to be realistic about it. Now, how can you find out about how realistic it could be? Again, I would say consult with your colleagues who are closer to the country, closer to the problem. People at the State Department. You can consult with the country team. You can get on a secure line and talk to people. You can go down and visit. I mean, people like to share their expertise. I would urge you to tap into that. When you do work with them, I would say mostly go through channels. Something that people don't realize is that just as you and your units respond to taskings from higher headquarters, embassies around the world respond to taskings from the State Department. Usually comes in the form of démarche cables. This is the course that we want the host country to take, and get out there and try to get them on that course. These cables come from the State Department in Washington. When you're developing strategy, keep in mind that you could have an input in what kind of instructions the embassies in your area of concern are getting. And you know, it usually involves some agony through the interagency process here in Washington, but you could craft those démarche instructions and tell the embassies what you want them to pursue. Again, it has to come through the State Department, but you're back here, you can provide a lot of input. Think about means and ways. Again, this gets us away from the diplo sauce. Don't just pour diplo sauce on it. Think about how they might pursue this objective, how they might combine instruments. I'd urge you not to micromanage from Washington. As in the case of the Dominican Republic, we knew pretty well, Ambassador Reinach knew pretty well how to do this. So don't micromanage, but you should give some thought to what we might offer. You know, if you're asking a country to do something, a lot of times they're going to come back and say, "Hey, what's in it for us?" Give that some thought. All right? Sometimes it's a give and take. Sometimes it's more of like a business negotiation. So you should keep in mind what you might offer in return. And finally, again, work with the country team. We have thousands of people who are living full-time in these countries because they want to know about it more and they want to share that knowledge with you who are struggling with these terrible problems that we face in the world. So I would say, whenever possible, work with the country team. Hey, look, the crest of the War College. You know, these 2 quill pens here, I don't know if most of you, State Department folks know this, but those quill pens represent the State Department and diplomacy. When a new class comes in, we pull the State Department students aside, we point to that and we say, hey, look, realize that that means that you have a place in this institution too. And that's an important point. But I'm going to flip it around a little bit. I'm going to say to all of you, look at those two quill pens. The diplomatic instrument is yours also. You as strategists, you as people who are struggling to deal with the terrible problems that the world's face, should remember that that diplomatic instrument is part of your arsenal. I urge you to use the rest of your time here at the War College to learn how to use it more effectively and proficiently. Rich, should we go to coffee?